Arrogant Millionaire demanded that an elderly woman be removed from the plane. But she didn't know that this woman, the plane was stationed at the boarding gate of the bustling New York airport, ready for its flight to Los Angeles. Passengers came and went, settling into their seats while flight attendants facilitated the process. The cabin, modern and cozy, was already filling with the usual hum of activity before takeoff. Among the last to board was an elegant and commanding figure walking down the aisle. Rebecca Carter, a 28-year-old woman, was dressed in a designer outfit and carried an Italian leather handbag likely worth more than many passengers earned in months. Her stride was confident, almost exaggerated, and she exuded an air of superiority that was impossible to ignore. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Rebecca was the heiress to a real estate empire and made it a point to showcase her status at every opportunity. When she reached her seat in first class, she let out an audible sigh of impatience upon realizing she would have company. It wasn't that she was used to sharing space. She typically flew on private jets, but a last-minute booking had left her with no other choice. As she arranged her belongings, another passenger entered the plane. It was Grace Miller, an elderly woman with silvery hair neatly styled into a bun. Dressed simply yet elegantly, she carried a small suitcase and wore a serene smile that stood out amidst the bustling crowd. A flight attendant escorted her to the seat next to Rebecca, prompting the younger woman to raise an eyebrow. Rebecca cast a quick glance at Grace and then at the flight attendant, as though expecting an explanation for what she considered a clear mistake. Without uttering a word, she put on her headphones and turned to face the window, making every effort to ignore the older woman's presence. Grace, in contrast, settled into her seat calmly, maintaining perfect posture and exuding a tranquility that seemed almost defiant. The cabin remained lively, but Grace Miller appeared unfazed by the commotion around her. With a gentle smile, she thanked the flight attendant who helped stow her luggage in the overhead compartment. As she took her seat next to Rebecca, her movements were slow yet deliberate, imbued with a natural elegance seemingly untouched by the rush of the modern world. Rebecca, however, failed to conceal her irritation. She let out a loud sigh as Grace adjusted herself, crossing her legs dramatically and turning up the volume on her headphones. Yet, the older woman's peaceful demeanor seemed to seep through the wall of disdain Rebecca had so carefully constructed. After a few moments, Grace turned to the young woman beside her and remarked pleasantly, "It's a beautiful day to fly, don't you think?" Rebecca didn't even glance away from the window. Instead, she muttered something unintelligible and adjusted her oversized sunglasses, a clear signal she had no interest in engaging. Grace didn't press the matter. With a small sigh, she pulled a hardcover book from her bag and began reading quietly, as though the tense atmosphere did not exist. Shortly after, the final passengers boarded, and the captain announced that the flight was ready for takeoff. Rebecca, still visibly annoyed, glanced at Grace as she read. Something about the older woman's demeanor, perhaps her serenity or the careful way she held her book, seemed to irritate Rebecca even more. She couldn't understand how someone with such little visual appeal or apparent status could be so at ease in a space she considered reserved for people like herself. Rebecca shifted in her seat, this time with abrupt movements that caused her arm to lightly brush against Grace's. "Could you try not to invade my space?" Rebecca snapped, her irritation barely concealed. Grace lifted her eyes from her book, her serene smile still lingering. "I apologize, dear. That wasn't my intention." Rebecca huffed and turned back to the window. But that brief interaction was enough to catch the attention of nearby passengers, who began exchanging curious glances. The plane began taxiing down the runway as passengers fastened their seatbelts, preparing for takeoff. Rebecca Carter, still visibly irritated, rolled her eyes every time Grace made the slightest movement beside her. The older woman, however, remained unbothered, engrossed in her book, a biography of an old American politician that seemed to captivate her. During the safety demonstration, Rebecca fidgeted incessantly, adjusting her seatbelt and seatback position, clearly attempting to draw the attention of a flight attendant. When one passed by, Rebecca seized the opportunity. "Excuse me," she said in a slightly condescending tone. "I'm sure there's been a mistake. I think this woman should be in economy class. Surely there's a more suitable seat for her." Grace, who had been listening without lifting her eyes from her book, closed it gently and rested her hands on her lap, turning to look at Rebecca with a calm but penetrating smile. The flight attendant, visibly uncomfortable, responded with professionalism. "Ms. Carter, all passengers are entitled to the seat they purchased. Is there anything else I can assist you with?" Rebecca didn't bother to hide her disdain. "Are you saying this is normal? Putting someone like her here? It doesn't make sense. This is a premium space." Murmurs began to spread through the cabin. Nearby passengers whispered among themselves, many clearly uneasy with Rebecca's behavior. Grace, still unshaken, spoke up before the flight attendant could respond. "My dear, sometimes it's good to share space with people who are different. It can be an opportunity to learn something new." Grace's calm tone seemed to only fuel Rebecca's fury. She crossed her arms and refused to reply. The flight attendant smiled at Grace, thanked her for her patience, and walked away as the atmosphere around them grew increasingly tense. Grace returned to her book, but not before casting a quick, meaningful glance at Rebecca, as though she recognized something the others had yet to notice. The young millionaire, however, was far too absorbed in stewing over her frustration to grasp the message behind that look. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the cabin was filled with the soft hum of the engines and the quiet murmur of conversations among passengers. Rebecca remained restless in her seat, fidgeting with her phone and checking notifications as if desperately seeking a distraction. Beside her, Grace continued engrossed in her book, her tranquil demeanor a stark contrast to the young woman's impatience. After a while, Rebecca pressed the call button for the flight attendant, her expression heavy with frustration. When the attendant approached, Rebecca spoke in a curt and commanding tone. "This isn't working. I need you to find another solution. It's unacceptable for me to spend the entire flight next to someone who just doesn't belong in this environment." The attendant, maintaining her composure, replied, "Ms. Carter, I understand your concern, but all seats are occupied. I kindly ask for your understanding." Rebecca let out a sarcastic laugh. "Understanding? Is this what you call first-class service? I think my father will want to hear about this. He owns shares in this company." The mention of her father and his supposed influence over the airline drew disapproving looks from nearby passengers, who were now fully tuned in to the unfolding drama. Grace, who had remained silent until now, gently closed her book and adjusted her glasses before speaking. "Forgive me for interrupting, dear, but it seems you're quite upset. May I ask what exactly is troubling you?" Rebecca turned to Grace, both surprised and irritated by the elderly woman's audacity. "The reason? You are the reason. This isn't a space for people like you." Rebecca's harsh tone triggered a moment of stunned silence in the cabin, followed by louder murmurs. Grace, however, maintained her composure. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying the young woman. After a brief pause, she responded calmly, "Ah, I see. Sometimes what we notice in those around us reflects what we feel about ourselves. Have you ever thought about that?" The remark caught Rebecca off guard. For a moment, she was speechless as Grace reopened her book, calmly signaling that the conversation had ended. The murmurs among the passengers continued, and the discomfort in the cabin was palpable. Rebecca Carter, visibly shaken by Grace's words, adjusted herself in her seat, but the glint of irritation in her eyes made it clear that the older woman's comment had left its mark. She wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially by someone who, in her view, lacked any status or significance. The flight attendant, sensing the tense atmosphere, approached again with a professional smile. "Ladies, may I offer you something to make your flight more comfortable? Perhaps a drink or a snack?" Grace accepted graciously. "A cup of tea, please." "That would be lovely." Rebecca, on the other hand, waved her off with an impatient gesture, as though even responding was an unnecessary effort. As Grace waited for her tea, she glanced around the interior of the plane with a seasoned gaze. Her serene expression concealed a deep thought that seemed to be slowly taking shape. When the flight attendant returned with her drink, Grace thanked her warmly, holding the cup as if it were part of a peace ritual. Rebecca, still sitting with her arms crossed, finally broke the silence. "You always have something wise to say, don't you? I bet you think you're better than everyone else with that saintly attitude." Grace looked at her, her expression calm but resolute. "No, my dear, I don't consider myself better than anyone. In fact, my life has been a continuous lesson in how not to judge others." She paused, taking a sip of her tea before continuing. "And in realizing that the greatest riches we possess are often invisible." Grace's words were spoken with such sincerity that, for a moment, even Rebecca hesitated to respond. Something about the statement seemed to resonate deep within her, though she quickly regained her composure. "Well, some people here clearly have very different ideas about what counts as wealth," she replied dismissively. Grace smiled faintly but didn't respond. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with unspoken meanings and emotions. The nearby passengers, now even more attentive, watched quietly, as if sensing that something deeper was unfolding. The flight continued, and the tension between Rebecca and Grace seemed to have turned into a silent spectacle for those seated nearby. Some exchanged discreet glances, while others peeked over their shoulders, curious to see how this unexpected clash would play out. Rebecca, unable to contain her restlessness, crossed and uncrossed her legs, drumming her fingers on the armrest. Grace, by contrast, maintained her flawless composure, seemingly unaffected by the charged atmosphere. After a few minutes of uncomfortable silence, a man seated in the row ahead turned around with a gentle smile. He appeared to be in his 50s, with friendly features and a relaxed demeanor. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing part of your conversation. Would you happen to be Grace Miller by any chance?" Grace lifted her eyes from the book, surprised but wearing her characteristic warm smile. "Yes, I am. Have we met?" The man shook his head, visibly impressed. "Not personally, but I'm familiar with your work. You're the founder of the New Hope Foundation, aren't you? I've read about the projects in Detroit and Houston. They're incredible." Hearing this, Rebecca frowned. She looked at Grace as if, for the first time, she was genuinely trying to figure her out. "Foundation? What's he talking about?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Grace closed her book, holding it in her lap with her hands gently clasped. "The New Hope Foundation is an organization I started many years ago. We work to provide affordable housing and skill development programs for vulnerable communities." She paused briefly before adding with modesty, "It's a collective effort. I don't do anything alone." Rebecca let out a short, incredulous laugh. "So, you're some kind of philanthropist? How interesting." There was a trace of sarcasm in her tone, but also a subtle curiosity beginning to surface. The man in the row ahead continued, "Interesting is an understatement. Mrs. Miller has changed thousands of lives. I met a young man in Detroit who managed to open his own business thanks to one of the foundation's programs." He turned to Grace, his admiration evident. "It's an honor to meet you." Grace nodded humbly in thanks, while Rebecca averted her gaze, processing the information. For the first time, she seemed to falter in her arrogant demeanor, as if Grace's presence carried more weight than she was ready to acknowledge. The man's words seemed to linger in Rebecca's mind, leaving an impact she couldn't easily dismiss. She shifted in her seat, but her usual air of superiority was giving way to something more subdued, almost contemplative. It was clear she was trying to piece together who Grace truly was. Meanwhile, Grace resumed reading her book, unbothered, as though nothing significant had occurred. Minutes passed, and Rebecca finally broke the silence, her voice carrying a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "So you're famous for helping people? That seems unlikely." Grace closed her book again, looking at Rebecca with an understanding smile. "I wouldn't say famous, my dear. The work I do isn't meant to be noticed. It's meant to be felt." She paused, studying Rebecca's expression before continuing. "Sometimes, the impact of our actions reaches far beyond what we can imagine. But that only matters when we set aside our ego." That last statement seemed to strike a chord with Rebecca. She turned her gaze away, as though those words had touched something she was trying to hide. After a moment of silence, Rebecca asked hesitantly, "And how did you even start all this? I mean, helping others?" Grace kept her gentle gaze as she replied, "It's been a long journey. I lost my family at a very young age and had to rebuild my life on my own. Along the way, I realized that many others were facing struggles similar to mine. That's when I decided that, if I could, I would do something to make the path easier for others." Rebecca looked surprised but said nothing. Her eyes reflected a whirlwind of thoughts. The idea that Grace had faced such significant hardships contradicted everything Rebecca had assumed about her. The discomfort was evident, but there was also a spark of something new, perhaps respect, or at least the realization that life held more depth than she had been willing to acknowledge before. As Grace returned to her book, Rebecca sat silently, fidgeting with her rings. For the first time during the flight, there was no sarcasm on her face, only introspection. The plane cruised through a clear blue sky, while the passengers, now more settled, resumed their own flight routines. Rebecca, however, remained restless. Grace's story echoed in her mind. It wasn't just the fact that Grace had overcome adversity. It was how she spoke about her experiences, without bitterness, without self-pity. This was something Rebecca, who often justified her arrogance by claiming the world was cruel, couldn't quite grasp. She turned to Grace again, trying to sound casual, but her voice betrayed genuine curiosity. "You said you lost your family young. That must have been difficult." The words came out more hesitant than Rebecca intended, but she pressed on. "How did you manage to move forward? A lot of people would just give up." Grace closed her book again, but this time she didn't rush to answer. She looked out the window for a moment, as if searching the clouds for a memory she was about to share. "It was hard, yes. I lost my parents in a car accident when I was 16. I had no one to turn to. I spent time in shelters working to survive. But it was there that I learned that even in the worst circumstances, there is kindness in the world. Some people helped me when I least expected it. A teacher who encouraged me to keep studying, a neighbor who gave me a temporary job. Those small acts showed me that life can be generous, even amidst pain." Rebecca listened in silence, her expression shifting from skepticism to something softer, almost vulnerable. "And that was enough? Those small things? Didn't it feel unfair?" Grace turned to her, her eyes shining with a mix of compassion and wisdom. "Life isn't fair, my dear, but fairness and kindness are different things. We don't always have control over what happens to us, but we can decide what to do with it. And for me, using my pain to help others was how I found meaning." Rebecca leaned back in her seat, processing those words. For the first time, it seemed she had no ready response, no sharp sarcasm or defensive remark. Instead, a deep silence hung between them, as though something invisible had been broken, or perhaps built, in that moment. As the silence lingered, Rebecca stared out the window, though it was clear her thoughts were far from the view outside. Grace's words seemed to echo in her mind, stirring something she couldn't quite identify. For someone used to measuring worth by status and appearances, hearing about kindness and meaning felt almost like a foreign language. After a few minutes, Rebecca turned to Grace again, but this time her tone was softer, almost hesitant. Do you think everyone has that ability to overcome things? I mean, not everyone has your kind of strength. Grace smiled gently, adjusting her glasses. Strength isn't something we're born with. It's something we build. Sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places. I'd say people are much stronger than they think. But not everyone gets the chance to find that out. Rebecca frowned, as if the answer unsettled her. She ran a hand through her hair, a nervous habit she rarely acknowledged. I'm not sure I agree. Some people just can't. They fall and don't get back up. Grace leaned forward slightly, her expression a mix of curiosity and compassion. Maybe that happens because they don't have anyone to help them. Have you ever thought about how many people around us might be falling while we don't even notice? Rebecca didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked away, her thoughts drifting to memories she usually avoided. There was something in her expression, a mix of melancholy and regret, that Grace noticed but chose not to address. Before the silence could stretch too long, a sound from the aisle drew their attention. A small child, no more than 3 years old, had wriggled free from his seat and was running, laughing, while his visibly exhausted mother hurried to catch him. The little boy tripped and fell, letting out a loud, piercing cry. Rebecca watched the scene, her initial instinct to look away, as she often did when faced with uncomfortable situations. But before she could act, Grace was already on her feet, moving with surprising agility for her age. She approached the boy and helped him up, speaking in a gentle tone. "Oh, it's okay, sweetheart. Just a little scare." The mother arrived moments later, repeatedly thanking Grace as she scooped her son into her arms. Grace returned to her seat with the same calm demeanor as always, but Rebecca continued to watch, perplexed. It was a simple gesture, almost insignificant, yet something about the scene seemed to strike Rebecca in an unexpected way. After the brief incident in the aisle, the cabin returned to its usual rhythm, but something felt different for Rebecca. She found herself observing Grace for longer moments, as if trying to decipher what made her so unique. It wasn't just the act of helping the child, it was the ease and sincerity with which she did it, without seeking recognition or attention. Rebecca couldn't recall the last time she'd seen someone behave that way. Grace resumed reading her book, but her eyes didn't remain on the pages for long. She noticed Rebecca's gaze and, with a friendly smile, asked, "Is everything all right, dear? You seem to have something on your mind." Rebecca hesitated, surprised to have been caught staring. Her first instinct was to look away and deny it, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was Grace's patience, or maybe the fact that, for the first time in a long while, she felt she didn't need to pretend to be someone she wasn't. "I don't understand you," Rebecca finally admitted, crossing her arms as if to shield herself from the vulnerability she had just exposed. "You've lost so much, been through so much. How can you be like this? So calm, so kind." Grace tilted her head slightly, her expression filled with understanding. "Kindness doesn't come from having no troubles, dear. It's something we choose even during the hardest times. In fact, sometimes it's because of the hardships that we choose to be better." Rebecca let out a short laugh, but without her usual sarcasm. "You make it sound so easy, like it's just a choice and that's it." Grace shook her head, her gaze serious but gentle. "It's not easy, and we don't always get it right. But the point isn't to be perfect. It's to try every day to be a little better than we were yesterday." Rebecca remained silent, reflecting on those words. She thought about her own life, filled with privilege yet also burdened with resentment and loneliness. For the first time, she considered that perhaps her view of strength and success was skewed. The sound of the flight attendant announcing the start of meal service brought Rebecca back to the present. She watched as Grace politely thanked the attendant for her tea, as if even the smallest acts of kindness deserved acknowledgement. Rebecca took a deep breath, feeling a different kind of weight in her chest. It was uncomfortable but also freeing. There was something about this flight and this woman beside her that was shifting her perspective on the world. The meal service began, and the flight attendant, wearing a professional smile, handed out neatly arranged trays to the passengers. Rebecca accepted hers without enthusiasm, while Grace expressed the same graciousness that seemed to overflow in everything she did. As the plane soared through the clouds, the surrounding environment seemed to fade into the background, as if their conversation had created a world of its own. Rebecca, however, didn't touch her food. Instead, she stared intently at her plate, as if trying to organize her thoughts. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You said you chose to use your pain to help others. What if someone doesn't know how to do that? What if they don't even know where to start?" Grace lifted her eyes from her meal, studying Rebecca with quiet attention. There was no judgment in her gaze, only an infinite patience. "Starting can be the hardest step, dear, but sometimes all we need to do is look around. The world always offers us opportunities to be better. Could be something simple, like listening to someone or offering a kind word." Rebecca shook her head, as if the idea was too good to be true. "It's not that simple for everyone. Some people carry too much." Grace leaned forward slightly, placing her utensils down carefully. "You're right. Some of us carry burdens that feel unbearable. But here's the secret. When we help someone carry their load, our own becomes lighter. Kindness has that effect. It spreads even if it starts as just a spark." Rebecca remained silent, her hands gripping the napkin as though she needed something tangible to hold onto. Her mind drifted to memories she had long tried to suppress. Moments when she herself had wished for someone to help her carry her weight but had never had the courage to ask. She looked at Grace, and for the first time, her voice was free of arrogance or defensiveness. What if someone never learned how to be kind? What if all they ever knew was competition, judgment, and loneliness? Grace took a deep breath before answering, her voice as soft as it was steady. "Then maybe that person has more reason than anyone else to start. Not because it's easy, but because it's what can set them free. Kindness is like a muscle. The more we use it, the stronger it gets." Rebecca nodded slowly but didn't reply. Her eyes glistened, though she blinked quickly to hide it. Something within her was beginning to shift, to crumble and rebuild all at once. The silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. Rebecca averted her gaze, trying to process everything Grace had said, while the older woman, ever patient, returned to her meal, giving Rebecca the space to face her own thoughts. The plane jolted gently from light turbulence, and passengers around them adjusted their seatbelts, though no one seemed concerned. Rebecca, however, remained still. Her fingers played with the napkin, folding and unfolding it as if it provided some small relief from the storm in her mind. Suddenly, she spoke, her voice quiet but laden with emotion. "My father always said the world was a jungle, that if you weren't at the top, you'd be crushed. I think that's what guided me until now." Grace lifted her eyes, her expression kind but focused. "Do you believe that?" Rebecca hesitated, biting her lower lip. "I don't know anymore. I grew up thinking I had to be tough, better, stronger. But it feels like the harder I try, the more alone I become." Grace set down her teacup and leaned in slightly. "That's a common perspective, my dear, but it isn't always true. Competing and achieving have their place, but not at the cost of our humanity. Being strong doesn't mean being alone. Sometimes, it means having the courage to let go of certain things to make space for what truly matters." Rebecca looked at her, confused and vulnerable. "And what really matters?" Grace smiled softly, as if holding a precious secret. "Connections. People. The impact we leave on their lives. You can have everything the world offers, but if you have no one to share your heart with, it will always feel empty." Rebecca felt a lump forming in her throat but forced herself to take a deep breath. For the first time, those words didn't sound like an empty cliché. They felt like something she desperately wanted to understand. The woman who had always prided herself on her independence now found herself confronting an uncomfortable truth. Her life was full of things but nearly devoid of meaning. Grace, sensing Rebecca's silence, added gently, "You're not alone, Rebecca. The first connection you need to make is with yourself. When that happens, the others will naturally follow." Rebecca lowered her head, blinking rapidly to hold back her tears. Something inside her, once rigid like a wall, was beginning to soften. The plane continued its journey through the blue sky, while time seemed to slow around Rebecca and Grace. The young millionaire sat quietly, lost in a sea of conflicting thoughts, while Grace, with her characteristic serenity, observed her discreetly, as if understanding that certain changes require silence to take root. Rebecca finally broke the silence, her voice low, almost a confession. "I used to think I was doing everything right. I worked so hard to earn respect, to not rely on anyone. But now, it feels like everything I've achieved means nothing." Grace leaned in slightly, her gaze filled with compassion. "It's not always easy to realize that, Rebecca. Sometimes we spend years chasing something only to discover that what truly matters was in a place we overlooked." Rebecca looked at Grace, her expression a mixture of confusion and sadness. "So what do I do now? How do I change? Feels like it's too late." Grace smiled gently, as if she had heard that question many times before. "It's never too late, dear. The first step is simple, acknowledging that we want to change. After that, we take it one day at a time. It's not about changing the entire world all at once, but about changing how you engage with it." Rebecca leaned back, letting those words sink in. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to retort or prove something. What Grace was saying made sense, but it also brought a kind of fear she couldn't quite name. "I don't know if I can," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Grace extended her hand, placing it gently over Rebecca's. "The strength is already within you, even if you can't see it yet. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us of that." Rebecca looked at Grace's hand resting on hers, feeling a connection that was both strange and comforting. That simple gesture, so unlike the cold, calculated interactions she was used to, awakened something new within her. Something she wasn't sure she wanted to confront, but instinctively knew was important. The connection between Rebecca and Grace seemed to grow with every passing moment, though Rebecca still carried the uncertainty of someone treading unfamiliar ground. As the plane continued its journey, Grace's words echoed in the young woman's mind, challenging years of deeply ingrained beliefs. The flight attendant walked down the aisle offering desserts, and Rebecca accepted a small plate of cheesecake, more as a distraction than out of hunger. She picked up her fork but hesitated before taking the first bite. Grace, noticing the gesture, said in a light-hearted tone, "Sometimes, even something as simple as enjoying dessert can be a step toward change." Rebecca allowed herself a faint smile, rare and unguarded, one she didn't even realize she had made. "You always have an answer, don't you?" Grace shrugged gently. "I don't have all the answers, but I like to think that if we look closely, life gives us many of them. It's just that we're not always ready to hear." Rebecca toyed with the cheesecake using her fork, avoiding Grace's gaze. "I don't know why I'm even listening to you. You probably think I'm a terrible person. Selfish, arrogant, and everything else people have called me." Grace leaned forward slightly, her eyes filled with sincerity. "I don't think that about you, Rebecca. I think you're someone trying to find her way. We all have our internal battles, and there's no shame in that. What matters is what we do once we recognize those struggles." Rebecca took a deep breath, her mind wandering to moments she preferred to forget. Her accomplishments, once so dazzling, now seemed far less significant. All that surfaced were her mistakes, her broken relationships, and the loneliness she had never admitted to herself. You make it sound so simple, Rebecca said, looking at Grace with a mix of curiosity and sadness. Like I can just decide to be different. It's not simple, Grace replied, her voice steady but gentle. It's a choice you make every day, Rebecca. It won't be perfect, and there will be hard days. But every small step matters. And you don't have to do it alone. Rebecca stayed silent, but something in her expression began to shift. It wasn't a complete transformation, but a small opening, a spark of something that, given time, could grow into something bigger. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, creating a soothing backdrop to Rebecca's quiet reflections. The plate of cheesecake in front of her remained mostly untouched, but she didn't seem to notice. For the first time in a long while, her focus wasn't on appearances or maintaining an impeccable facade, but on the words Grace had offered her, words that felt like a mirror. Rebecca finally turned to Grace, as if preparing to confess something. Her voice came out hesitant, almost fragile. I don't think I've ever had a real connection with anyone. Not with my parents, not with friends. If I can even call them that. Grace, with the patience of someone who had heard stories like this before, leaned forward slightly, resting her clasped hands in her lap. True connections aren't easy, Rebecca. They require vulnerability. And vulnerability can be terrifying, especially when we've learned to protect ourselves at all costs. Rebecca nodded slowly, as if she was finally beginning to grasp the weight of those words. My mother always told me I had to be strong, that showing emotions was a sign of weakness. I guess I ended up believing her. Grace smiled gently, though her eyes were serious. Many people believe that, dear, but real strength comes from facing what we feel, not hiding it. Showing your emotions doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Rebecca turned her gaze to the window, watching the clouds drift by at a steady pace. I feel so lost, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. Grace waited a moment before responding, her voice steady yet full of warmth. Being lost isn't the end of the road. Sometimes it's where the real journey begins. What matters now is what you choose to do with this realization. Rebecca took a deep breath, as if trying to absorb the weight of the conversation. Something inside her seemed to stir, a feeling long suppressed now beginning to emerge. It wasn't just sadness or regret, but a fragile and unfamiliar sense of hope, delicate and new, like a timid flame. She looked at Grace again, this time with something that resembled admiration. I don't know where to start, but I think I want to try. Grace held Rebecca's hand in a firm yet comforting gesture. That's already a beginning, dear. Never underestimate the strength it takes to simply want to change. The plane began its descent into Los Angeles Airport, and passengers adjusted their seatbelts and stowed their belongings, preparing for landing. The pilot's voice echoed distantly over the intercom, but Rebecca barely heard it. Something deeper was happening within her, a kind of transformation she had never thought possible. Grace, seated beside her, remained serene as always, though there was a lightness to her expression, as if she knew her presence had made a difference. Rebecca glanced at her and, with a timid smile, said, "Thank you for all of this, for listening, for talking to me. I don't think I realized how much I needed something like this until now." Grace gave Rebecca's hand a gentle squeeze, a small gesture, yet one full of meaning. Sometimes all we need is someone to truly see us, dear. And remember, you have the strength to follow this new path. I believe in you. The plane touched down smoothly, the slight jolt snapping Rebecca's thoughts back to reality. She looked out the window, feeling a mix of nervousness and hope. As strange as it seemed, this flight had been more than just a journey between cities. For her, it was the beginning of something new. As the passengers began to disembark, Rebecca hesitated before reaching for her bag. She turned to Grace, as if wanting to hold onto the moment for just a bit longer. "Will you be in Los Angeles for long?" Grace smiled, her expression filled with a tenderness that seemed capable of calming any storm. "A few days," I have a meeting with one of the organizations we support there. But who knows? Perhaps our paths will cross again." Rebecca nodded, trying to conceal the emotion creeping into her voice. "I hope they do." Walking together toward the exit, Grace paused for a moment, placing a hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "Remember, change begins with small choices. And when things get tough, just stop and remind yourself, you're not alone." Rebecca smiled, a smile that felt more genuine than any she'd given in years. "Thank you, Grace." "Truly." Grace nodded, and the two parted ways, each heading in separate directions through the terminal. But for Rebecca, something had shifted profoundly. As she walked through the airport, she pulled out her phone, opening a messaging app. Her finger hovered over the contact of an old friend she had pushed away years ago, one of the many connections she had sacrificed in the name of ambition. With a deep breath, filled with equal parts apprehension and determination, she began typing. "Hi, it's been a while since we've talked. I've been thinking about you. Maybe we could meet up sometime? I miss our friendship." Hitting send, Rebecca felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. She didn't know exactly where this path would lead, but for the first time, that didn't scare her. After all, as Grace had said, change begins with small choices. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and a comment. Let me know which city you're watching this video from. A big hug, and see you in the next story.